They publicly humiliated people, thinking they could get away with it. They didn't know Chuck Norris was nearby. That night will end very differently than they expected. Watch till the end, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. The day ended without a clear boundary, as if it had never truly begun, and therefore could not truly finish. Chuck Norris left the building where the final formalities of the case had been wrapped up, stepped out into the evening air, and paused for a moment longer than necessary. The door closed behind him with a dull, indifferent sound, the kind that suggested paperwork had been signed, responsibilities transferred, and outcomes officially accepted. On paper, everything was resolved. In reality, something remained lodged deep inside him, heavy and unsettled, like dust that refused to settle after a collapse. The case itself no longer needed to be replayed in detail. Chuck had learned long ago not to torture himself with unnecessary recollections. Still, fragments clung to him. The look on certain faces, the way truth had been acknowledged too late to change what truly mattered, the hollow relief of people who could now move on because the system had done what it always did, just enough to justify itself. There had been no dramatic failure, no explosive injustice that demanded anger. That was what made it worse. It had been quiet, procedural, clean, and it had left him empty. He stood on the steps, letting the city breathe around him. Cars passed, their headlights streaking across the pavement. Somewhere down the block, a group of people laughed too loudly, the sound sharp against the early evening. Chuck felt the weight in his shoulders, the familiar stiffness in his neck, the subtle ache that came not from physical strain, but from restraint. He had held himself together all day, spoken when required, listened when expected, and remained composed in rooms where composure was mistaken for acceptance. His car was parked only a short distance away. He could see it between two streetlights, familiar and patient. The rational choice would have been to get in, turn the key, and let the road do the thinking for him. Instead, he stayed where he was, staring at the slow rhythm of the city. The idea of sitting alone in the enclosed silence of the car felt wrong. Too immediate, too final. Without consciously deciding, he turned away from the parking lot and started walking. At first, his steps were mechanical, driven by habit rather than intention. He followed the sidewalk along the main street, past storefronts glowing with artificial warmth. The city was transitioning, shedding the last of the day's urgency and slipping into its nighttime skin. Office lights went dark one by one, restaurants filled, neon signs hummed, the air cooled just enough to sharpen his senses. Walking had always helped him think, though tonight thinking was the last thing he wanted. His mind drifted anyway, not toward specific memories but toward a general sense of disconnection. He felt removed from the flow around him, like someone watching life through thick glass. People passed him in clusters or pairs, absorbed in their own conversations and concerns. No one looked twice at him. That anonymity should have been comforting. Instead, it reinforced the quiet hollowness he carried. He lengthened his stride, letting the movement loosen his muscles. His breathing steadied, falling into a rhythm that matched his pace. Each step carried him farther from the building, farther from the sterile rooms and controlled voices, yet the weight followed. It always did. The truth Chuck had learned over the years was that you could walk away from places, but not from the things they left inside you. As he moved deeper into the city, the surroundings subtly changed. The clean facades gave way to older buildings, their paint chipped, their windows barred or dark. The sidewalks narrowed. Streetlights grew more spaced out, casting uneven pools of light that left long stretches in shadow. Chuck noticed these changes automatically, the way someone trained to read environments always did. He did not tense, but he remained aware. He took a longer route without consciously choosing it, bypassing the more direct streets that would have led him home faster. Part of him understood why. Going straight home meant facing silence, walls, and time to think. Walking gave him delay, movement, a sense of forward momentum that did not require decisions. The city spoke in layers. Somewhere above, a train rumbled along elevated tracks. Farther away, a siren wailed briefly before fading. Closer by, the sound of footsteps echoed behind him, then drifted off as someone turned down another street. Chuck registered each sound without reacting, cataloging them, letting them pass. He crossed an intersection where the light had already changed, cars idling impatiently as he moved through. A driver honked, more out of habit than anger. Chuck did not look back. He kept going, his gaze forward, his posture relaxed but balanced. As he walked, his thoughts returned, uninvited, to the quiet failure of the day. Not a failure in outcome, perhaps, but in meaning. He had done what was required. He had followed the rules. And yet the result felt insufficient, like applying a bandage to a wound that needed stitches. That realization left him with a dull sense of complicity, a feeling he disliked more than outright injustice. He had spent much of his life believing in lines between right and wrong, between action and consequence, between intervention and restraint. Over time, those lines had blurred. Tonight, they felt especially faint. He wondered, not for the first time, how many compromises a person could make before the core of who they were began to erode. The temperature dropped another degree as the sun fully disappeared. Chuck adjusted his jacket slightly, though he hardly felt the cold. His body was used to discomfort. It was the mental fatigue that weighed on him now, the kind that made even simple choices feel heavier than they should. He passed a small convenience store with flickering lights. Inside, a lone clerk leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone. Outside, a man argued with someone on the other end of a call, his voice sharp and strained. Chuck walked past without slowing. These were fragments of other lives, intersecting briefly with his path before dissolving again. A few blocks later, the street grew quieter. Fewer cars passed. The buildings pressed closer together, their facades bearing the marks of neglect. Trash gathered near the curbs, pushed there by wind and indifference. The air smelled faintly of oil and damp concrete. Chuck knew this part of town by reputation more than experience. It was not a place people chose to linger. He felt the subtle shift in atmosphere, the way tension seemed to hang just beneath the surface. It did not alarm him, but it sharpened his awareness. His steps slowed almost imperceptibly, not out of fear, but out of habit. He scanned his surroundings without turning his head too much, noting doorways, alleys, and the patterns of light and shadow. Despite the change in environment, his mind remained inward, circling the same unresolved feelings. He thought about the people from the case, about how easily lives could be redirected by decisions made in quiet rooms. He thought about his own role in those processes, about the limits he had accepted. The emptiness he felt was not dramatic. It was steady, persistent, like a low-pressure system that never fully moved on. He told himself he was tired. That was true enough. But fatigue did not fully explain the sense of dislocation, the feeling that something fundamental was out of alignment. He had done everything expected of him, yet satisfaction remained out of reach. That contradiction gnawed at him more than any overt conflict ever had. As he continued, the streets narrowed further, and the light grew patchy. A group of young men stood near a closed storefront, talking in low voices. They glanced at Chuck as he passed, then returned to their conversation. He neither acknowledged them nor avoided them. He simply walked, his presence calm, unremarkable. A short distance ahead, the street bent slightly, and the soundscape changed. The steady hum of distant traffic faded, replaced by sharper, more distinct noises. Laughter, harsh and mocking, cut through the quiet. It was followed by raised voices, carrying an edge that made Chuck's focus snap outward. He slowed, his attention shifting fully to the present moment. The laughter was not casual. It had weight to it, the kind that came from power exercised without restraint. Chuck could not yet see the source, but the tone alone was enough to register as wrong. He stopped for a brief second at the edge of a pool of light, his expression unchanged. The rational part of him suggested continuing on, letting whatever was happening resolve itself. He was tired. He had no obligation here. The city was full of moments like this, and he could not intervene in all of them. Yet another part of him, quieter but more insistent, refused to let him move on without understanding what he was hearing. It was not anger that held him there, but a tightening in his chest, a subtle signal that something was crossing a line he still cared about. He resumed walking, more slowly now, the sound growing clearer with each step. Voices overlapped, one louder than the others, pushing, pressing. Chuck's shoulders squared slightly, not in preparation for conflict, but in readiness. His fatigue did not vanish, but it shifted, becoming something more focused. He rounded the bend and saw the scene unfolding on the sidewalk ahead. The distance between him and the confrontation was still enough to give him a moment to observe. Two men stood close to a young couple, their bodies positioned in a way that blocked movement rather than inviting conversation. Their posture was aggressive without being overtly violent, a calculated display of dominance. The young man they faced held himself stiffly, jaw clenched, while the woman beside him hovered close, her tension visible even from where Chuck stood. Chuck did not yet move. He watched, assessing not just the people involved, but the space around them, the way the street emptied itself of witnesses. A few windows glowed faintly above, curtains drawn. The road beside them was momentarily clear of cars. The city, indifferent as ever, provided no immediate interference. The laughter continued, sharp and deliberate. Chuck felt the last of his inward focus dissolve. The heavy day, the empty case, the unresolved questions, all of it receded into the background. In its place came clarity, simple and uncompromising. He had not set out looking for trouble. He had wanted nothing more than to walk home and be done with the day. Yet as he stood there, watching the imbalance of power play out on a dim sidewalk, he understood something with quiet certainty. Tonight was not finished with him yet. Chuck did not step forward immediately. He remained where he was, just beyond the brighter spill of the streetlight, letting his eyes adjust to the darker stretch ahead. From this distance, the scene revealed itself in fragments rather than a single clear picture, and that suited him. He had learned long ago that understanding came not from rushing in, but from seeing how a situation breathed on its own. The block itself carried the unmistakable weight of neglect. Buildings leaned toward one another as if conspiring, their brick faces scarred by time and indifference. Windows were either shuttered or shielded by bars, the few uncovered panes reflecting dull pinpricks of light from passing traffic several streets away. The sidewalk was uneven, patched and repatched, with shallow puddles collecting in the low spots. Graffiti crawled along the walls, some fresh, some so faded it had become part of the surface beneath it. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete and old oil, a scent that never fully disappeared in neighborhoods like this. The streetlights were spaced too far apart, leaving pockets of darkness between them. The confrontation occupied one of those pockets, half lit and half swallowed by shadow. Chuck could see enough to understand the geometry of it. Two men stood with casual aggression, their bodies angled not just toward the couple, but toward the street itself, claiming the space as their own. They were not shouting wildly or flailing. Their power came from how comfortably they occupied the moment, how certain they were that nothing would interrupt them. The young man they faced was dark-skinned, tall but lean, his shoulders held stiffly as if bracing against an invisible pressure. He kept his feet planted, not backing away, though it was clear he was aware of every inch of space being taken from him. His hands hovered near his sides, fingers flexing slightly, a sign of tension rather than readiness to fight. He was trying to look calm, to appear unprovoked, but the effort showed in the tightness of his jaw and the shallow rise and fall of his chest. Beside him stood the woman, pale under the streetlight, her hair pulled back in a way that suggested she had not expected trouble tonight. She stayed close to him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, as if distance alone might invite worse. Her eyes darted between the two men in front of them, then toward the empty street beyond, searching for an opening that did not exist. She did not cry or shout. Her fear was quieter, more contained, and for that reason, more dangerous. The two men confronting them wore the marks of their allegiance openly. Their heads were shaved close, the pale skin catching the light. Their clothing was simple, almost uniform in its intent, designed not to stand out but to signal belonging to those who knew what to look for. Their posture was loose, confident, the posture of men who had done this before and expected it to go the same way it always did. They laughed, not loudly, but often. It was the kind of laughter that did not seek approval, only reaction. Each sound was calculated to unsettle, to remind the couple that they were not alone and not in control. One of the men stepped slightly to the side, narrowing the space behind the young man, while the other leaned in closer, his presence invasive even without physical contact. Chuck felt the familiar tightening at the base of his spine, a signal his body sent before his mind caught up. He cataloged what he saw with practiced detachment. Two aggressors, no visible weapons, but hands free and ready. The couple was cornered by positioning rather than force, a tactic that relied on intimidation and the assumption that no one would interfere. The street was mostly empty. The nearest occupied window was several floors up, its curtains drawn. If anyone inside heard the voices, they gave no sign of it. He shifted his weight slightly, testing the ground beneath his boots. The uneven pavement offered both risk and opportunity. He noted the narrow alley a few yards away, the recessed doorway across the street, the placement of a broken trash bin near the curb. These details arranged themselves automatically in his mind. Not as plans yet, but as possibilities. For a moment, he considered the simplest option, walking past. It would take only a few seconds. He could cross the street, keep his head down, and be gone before the situation escalated further. No one would stop him. No one would expect him to intervene. The city was built on that expectation, on the quiet agreement that everyone had their own problems and no obligation to carry another's. The thought did not sit well. He watched as one of the men leaned closer to the woman now, invading her space deliberately, forcing her to either step back or press closer to the young man. She chose the latter, her hand brushing his arm in a small instinctive gesture of solidarity. The man facing them noticed, and his smile widened, pleased by the reaction he had provoked. Chuck exhaled slowly. He was not angry. That surprised him, given the circumstances. What he felt instead was a calm, almost clinical clarity. The emptiness he had carried since leaving the building earlier had shifted, condensing into something sharper. He understood in that moment that this was not about heroism or impulse. It was about a line being crossed in front of him, a line he still recognized even after years of compromise and restraint. He took a step forward, then another, his pace unhurried. The sound of his boots on the pavement drew attention before his presence fully registered. One of the aggressors glanced over his shoulder, his expression flickering briefly with irritation at the interruption. When his eyes settled on Chuck, the irritation deepened into mild curiosity. Chuck stopped a few yards away, close enough to be clearly involved, far enough to avoid immediate escalation. He positioned himself slightly to the side rather than directly between the men and the couple, a subtle choice that left the young man and woman a potential path of retreat without appearing overtly confrontational. From this distance, he could see the details more clearly. The men's eyes were alert but not cautious. They did not perceive him as a threat, not yet. To them, he was an older man out of place, an inconvenience rather than a danger. Chuck let that perception stand. There was no advantage in correcting it prematurely. The couple noticed him too. The young man's eyes flicked toward Chuck, a flash of surprise crossing his face, followed by something like guarded hope. The woman's gaze lingered a moment longer, searching Chuck's expression for clues. What she saw there must have steadied her, because her shoulders lowered just a fraction, though the tension did not leave her completely. The aggressors adjusted their stance, one of them turning more fully toward Chuck now, as if to assess whether he would speak or move closer. The other remained angled toward the couple, maintaining the pressure. The laughter stopped. In its place came a heavier silence, broken only by the distant sound of a car passing at the far end of the block. Chuck did not speak. He did not gesture. He simply stood, his posture relaxed, his hands visible and empty. His presence altered the balance of the scene without announcing itself. He was not imposing himself physically, but he was unmistakably present. The men seemed to sense the shift, even if they did not fully understand it. One took a half step forward, testing the space between himself and Chuck, his chin lifting slightly in challenge. The other glanced down the street, checking for witnesses or interference. Finding none, he returned his attention to the couple, emboldened by the emptiness around them. Chuck's gaze moved between them, steady and unflinching. He took in the way their weight shifted, the way one favored his right side, the way the other's hands flexed in anticipation. He also noted the couple's position, how close they were to the wall, how limited their options had become. The situation was balanced on a narrow edge, and it would not take much to push it into open violence. He felt the familiar internal resistance rise, The last attempt by his mind to argue for restraint. He was tired. He had already given more than he had today. This was not his responsibility. The city had systems for dealing with this, flawed as they were. Stepping in would complicate things, drag him into consequences he had no desire to face tonight. The argument failed to convince him. The image of the day's case surfaced briefly, unbidden. Faces from earlier, voices that had spoken in measured tones about outcomes and procedures, while lives bent quietly under the weight of those decisions. The memory sharpened his resolve rather than weakening it. He had walked away from that room feeling that something essential had been left undone. Here, in this narrow stretch of sidewalk, the choice felt clearer. He stepped forward again, closing the distance by a single, deliberate pace. It was enough. The aggressor closest to him reacted instantly, his body tensing, his shoulders squaring. He said something sharp, a warning or a dismissal. It hardly mattered. Chuck's focus was not on the words but on the movement that followed, the subtle shift that signaled intent. The man's hand came up, not to strike yet, but to assert space, to push or grab, to reestablish dominance. That was the moment. Chuck moved with quiet efficiency, his actions economical and precise. He did not rush. He simply stepped into the space the man had claimed, redirecting the motion before it could fully form. The contact was brief, controlled, and decisive. The man found his balance compromised, his confidence shattered in the same instant. He went down hard enough to understand what had happened, but not hard enough to suffer lasting harm. The sound of the impact echoed sharply in the narrow street, louder than it had any right to be. The other aggressor froze, his bravado evaporating as the reality of the situation caught up with him. The couple stared, stunned by the sudden reversal, their fear momentarily overtaken by disbelief. Chuck released his hold and stepped back, reestablishing the distance he had closed. His breathing remained even. His expression did not change. The message had been delivered without flourish or excess. The man on the ground struggled to sit up, his movements uncoordinated, his shock more pronounced than his pain. His companion took a step back, reassessing, his eyes darting between Chuck and the couple, searching for a way to regain control that no longer existed. Chuck did not linger. He turned slightly, angling his body to allow the couple a clear path away from the confrontation. They did not hesitate. The young man guided the woman past him, their steps quick but unsteady as adrenaline took hold. They did not speak, and Chuck did not look at them directly. Words were unnecessary now. As they moved off down the street, Chuck shifted his attention back to the remaining aggressor. The man glared at him, a mixture of anger and something darker flashing across his face. It was a look Chuck recognized, the kind that promised memory rather than immediate action. Chuck held that gaze for a brief moment longer than strictly necessary. In that silence, a message passed between them, unspoken but clear. This was over, here and now. What came next would be a choice. Chuck turned away before the moment could harden into something else. He walked down the block without accelerating, his pace steady, his posture unchanged. Behind him, he could hear the men moving, one cursing softly as he helped the other to his feet. He did not look back. As he reached the end of the street, the tension in his shoulders began to ease, replaced by a different kind of awareness. The encounter had not erased the emptiness he carried, but it had shifted it, given it a shape he could recognize. He told himself the matter was finished. He had intervened, prevented harm, and moved on. There was no reason to expect otherwise. Yet as he stepped onto the next street, bathed once more in the uneven glow of streetlights, a faint unease lingered. He could not quite explain it, but it followed him like a shadow, subtle and persistent. The city had a way of circling back on unfinished business. Chuck continued on toward the distant bus stop, unaware that the night had not yet closed its account with him. Chuck walked for several blocks after leaving the troubled street, letting distance do what words could not. The sounds of the confrontation faded behind him, replaced by the muted rhythm of the city at night. His pace remained even, his breathing steady, but his awareness stayed sharpened, attuned to shifts in sound and movement. He did not look back. He had learned long ago that looking back often invited complications that forward motion avoided. The adrenaline from the encounter ebbed gradually, leaving behind a controlled alertness rather than exhaustion. His hands felt normal, neither clenched nor trembling. That was how he knew he had acted within himself, not beyond it. He had intervened, applied just enough force to disrupt the balance, and then withdrawn. There had been no excess, no need to prove anything. The line had been crossed, and he had stepped over it just long enough to push it back into place. As he moved deeper into the quieter streets, he replayed the sequence in his mind. Not with regret, but with assessment. He recalled the way the aggressor's confidence had collapsed the moment control was taken from him. How quickly bravado evaporated when faced with something unexpected and decisive. It confirmed what Chuck had always believed. Most cruelty thrived on the assumption that no one would resist. Break that assumption, even briefly, and the entire structure weakened. He reached a corner where the street opened slightly, allowing more light to spill across the pavement. A bus stop stood ahead, its shelter empty, illuminated by a flickering overhead lamp. Chuck slowed as he approached, his body finally allowing the tension to ease. He stepped under the shelter and leaned lightly against one of the metal supports, not out of fatigue, but out of habit. Waiting spaces had always felt like neutral ground to him, places where movement paused and thought caught up. The bus schedule posted inside the shelter showed only one remaining route for the night, its next arrival marked with a long wait time. Chuck studied it briefly, then looked away. Time no longer pressed on him the way it once had. If anything, he welcomed the delay. Standing there, he could feel the city settling, the night drawing its boundaries tighter. His thoughts drifted back, not to the aggressors, but to the couple. He had seen the relief on the young man's face, the way tension had drained from his posture the moment the balance shifted. He wondered where they were now, whether they would reach home without further trouble. He knew better than to assume his intervention had solved anything beyond the immediate moment. Still, moments mattered. Sometimes all it took was one interruption to change the course of a night. A car passed, its headlights briefly washing over the shelter. Chuck watched it disappear, then turned his attention inward again. He considered the risk he had taken, small as it might seem. There were always consequences, some immediate, some delayed. He had no illusions about that. Yet he felt no regret. If anything, the encounter had clarified something he had been struggling to articulate since the end of the day's case. He had not intervened because he was obligated. He had intervened because walking past would have felt like another quiet compromise, another piece of himself filed away for the sake of convenience. That realization brought with it a subtle shift in his mood. The emptiness he had carried earlier had not vanished, but it had loosened its grip, as if acknowledging that not all outcomes were dictated by systems and paperwork. The distant hum of an approaching engine pulled his attention back to the present. The bus emerged from the darkness at the far end of the street, its headlights steady and bright. Chuck straightened as it rolled closer, the sound of air brakes hissing softly as it came to a stop. The doors opened with a mechanical sigh, and warm light spilled out onto the pavement. He stepped aboard, nodding briefly to the driver without meeting his eyes. The interior was mostly empty, just as he had expected. A few passengers sat scattered along the length of the bus, each absorbed in their own private exhaustion. The air carried the faint smell of rubber and cleaning solution, familiar and oddly comforting. Chuck moved down the aisle and chose a seat near the middle, close enough to the door to observe without drawing attention. As the bus pulled away from the curb, he settled into the seat, resting his hands loosely on his thighs. The motion of the vehicle smoothed his thoughts, the steady vibration acting like a metronome. Outside the windows, the city slid past in blurred streaks of light and shadow. Inside, the brightness remained constant, a small island of clarity moving through the night. Chuck allowed himself to relax just a little. He leaned back and let his gaze drift, taking in the faces of the other passengers without focusing on any one of them. There was a woman near the front with her head resting against the window, eyes closed. Farther back, a man stared at his phone, his expression blank. Near the rear, two teenagers whispered to each other, their laughter muted by the late hour. None of them paid Chuck any attention. The bus stopped at the next corner, and a couple of passengers boarded. Chuck noted them without concern, his awareness still present, but no longer keyed to danger. He told himself that the encounter on the street was behind him, resolved in the only way such things ever truly were. He had no reason to expect further trouble. The city was vast, its paths intersecting and diverging endlessly. The odds of crossing the same people again on the same night were slim. And yet, as the bus continued on its route, that faint unease he had felt earlier returned, threading itself through his calm. It was not fear, it was intuition, honed by years of paying attention when others did not. He scanned the interior again, this time more deliberately, his eyes moving from seat to seat, from reflection to reflection in the darkened windows. At the next stop, the doors opened, and several figures climbed aboard together. Chuck recognized them instantly, even before his mind fully processed the sight. The shaved heads, the familiar set of shoulders, the way they carried themselves with a forced ease that masked intent. They were the same men from the street, joined now by others who shared their bearing and their purpose. For a brief moment, no one moved. The men stepped inside and paused, letting their eyes adjust, letting the scene present itself. Chuck remained seated, his expression unchanged, his posture relaxed. He did not avert his gaze, but neither did he stare. He knew better than to react too soon. The men spread out slightly as they moved down the aisle, some taking seats, others remaining standing near the poles. Their movements were casual, almost careless, but Chuck could see the underlying coordination. This was not a coincidence. They had not boarded this bus by chance. Their presence carried intention, sharpened by the memory of the earlier encounter. One of them glanced toward Chuck, then looked away, as if confirming something internally. A subtle exchange passed between them, a tilt of the head, a tightening of the jaw. Chuck felt the last of his remaining doubt dissolve. The night had not released him after all. It had simply changed its shape. He adjusted his position slightly, placing his feet more firmly on the floor, his shoulders settling into a balanced alignment. He did not prepare for a fight, not yet. He prepared to observe, to understand how this would unfold. The bus lurched forward again, pulling away from the stop, carrying them all deeper into the night. The men did not approach immediately. They waited, testing the space, gauging reactions. Chuck sensed their eyes on him, felt the weight of their attention like a pressure against his back. He remained still, refusing to grant them the satisfaction of acknowledgement. Inside, his thoughts were clear, stripped of hesitation. There would be no easy exit this time, no opportunity to step away and let distance do the work. The bus made another stop, and no one disembarked. The doors closed, sealing the interior once more. The vehicle felt smaller now, the air heavier, as if the presence of unresolved intent had altered its dimensions. Chuck glanced toward the front, noting the driver's focus on the road, unaware or unwilling to engage with what was unfolding behind him. As the bus moved on, Chuck allowed himself a quiet acknowledgement of the situation. He had hoped briefly that the earlier intervention would end as it so often did, contained to its moment. Instead, it had followed him, gathered weight, and returned in a more confined form. The line he had crossed on the street had not vanished. It had simply extended, stretching now into this narrow aisle and the space between these seats. He breathed out slowly, grounding himself in the present. Whatever came next would require the same restraint and precision as before, perhaps more. There would be no room for excess here, no tolerance for mistakes. Others were present now, innocent and vulnerable, and that changed the equation entirely. Chuck looked straight ahead as the bus rolled through the darkened streets, its interior lights steady and unforgiving. The city outside slipped past, indifferent to the tension gathering within. He understood with calm certainty that the next chapter of the night would not allow him the luxury of simply walking away. The bus pressed on, carrying them all toward an inevitable confrontation, and Chuck remained ready, his resolve quiet but unyielding, as the distance between choice and necessity closed. The bus moved steadily through the city, its engine humming with a consistency that felt almost deliberate, as if it were trying to impose order on a night that had already begun to unravel. Chuck remained seated near the middle, his gaze forward, his posture relaxed enough not to draw attention, yet balanced enough to respond without delay. The encounter on the street had followed him here, reshaped and multiplied, and now it occupied the same enclosed space, bound by steel walls and scheduled stops. The interior lighting was bright and unforgiving. White ceiling panels cast an even glow across the aisle. The seats, the metal poles polished smooth by countless hands. Nothing here hid in shadow. Every movement was visible, every shift in posture exposed. Outside the windows, the city was a blur of darkness and scattered lights, storefronts closed, intersections slipping past like markers on a map no one was studying anymore. Inside, time seemed to slow, stretching each second until it carried more weight than it should have. The bus was not full. It never was at this hour. A handful of passengers occupied scattered seats, each wrapped in their own exhaustion. A man near the front stared straight ahead, his jaw set, pretending not to notice the change in atmosphere behind him. A woman several rows back clutched her bag a little tighter than necessary, her eyes fixed on the reflection in the window rather than the aisle. Two teenagers whispered to each other in nervous bursts, their earlier laughter gone, replaced by an uneasy awareness they did not yet understand. The men who had boarded together spread themselves with quiet intention. Two took seats along the aisle, positioning themselves so their knees angled outward, subtly narrowing the path. Another stood near the rear door, one hand resting casually on a pole, his stance loose but alert. The rest remained standing, shifting their weight with the slow rhythm of the bus. Their movements synchronized just enough to suggest planning without discipline. Chuck felt their presence like a low-frequency vibration, not loud enough to demand immediate response but impossible to ignore. He did not turn his head. He did not need to. Reflections in the window provided all the information he required. He saw the way their eyes flicked toward him, then away, then back again. He saw the tightening of shoulders, the small adjustments of stance as they claimed space that did not belong to them. The bus stopped, doors opening with a familiar hiss. No one got off. No one got on. The doors closed again, sealing the interior. The sound lingered a moment longer than usual, echoing faintly, as if underlining the fact that the opportunity for simple escape had passed. Chuck noted the distance to the doors, the angle of the aisle, the proximity of the poles and seats. He cataloged everything without tension, the way one might memorize a room out of habit. He thought briefly of the couple on the street, of how quickly the situation there had escalated and resolved. Out here, in this narrow corridor of light and metal, the dynamics were different. There was no open space, no easy retreat, no anonymity in the dark. Any movement would ripple outward, affecting everyone present. That awareness anchored him, sharpening his restraint. The men did not approach him yet. They waited. That was their mistake. Chuck had learned that waiting often betrayed uncertainty, even when disguised as confidence. They were gauging him, deciding whether he would shrink or provoke. They wanted a reaction, some signal that they could seize upon to justify what they intended to do next. He gave them nothing. His stillness was not passive, it was deliberate, an invitation to underestimate him again. The bus rolled on, passing through neighborhoods that grew quieter with each block. The pattern of stops became predictable, the intervals stretching longer as the route moved away from the busier parts of the city. Each stop carried the same brief pause, the same opening and closing of doors, the same subtle tightening of the atmosphere afterward. With every mile, the sense of enclosure deepened. Chuck adjusted his breathing, slow and even, grounding himself in the physical reality of the moment. He felt the vibration of the floor beneath his boots, the faint sway of the bus as it took a turn. He let his senses anchor him, refusing to let anticipation pull him into premature action. Whatever happened would happen here, not in his imagination. One of the men shifted closer, his footsteps light but intentional. He stopped a few seats away, pretending to steady himself against a pole as the bus lurched slightly. Chuck caught the movement in the corner of his eye, noted the angle of approach, the way the man positioned himself to block part of the aisle. Still, Chuck did not look at him directly. Another man laughed quietly, a short, humorless sound that carried just far enough to be heard without drawing the driver's attention. It was a test, a probe into the reactions of those around them. The teenagers fell silent. The woman near the window stiffened. The man at the front remained rigidly forward-facing, his knuckles whitening where his hands rested on his knees. Chuck's thoughts remained clear. He did not feel the rush of adrenaline that often accompanied moments like this. Instead, there was a narrowing of focus, a sense of alignment between intention and readiness. He knew the moment was coming. He also knew that timing would matter more than force. The bus slowed as it approached another stop, its engine lowering in pitch. The doors opened. A cold draft slipped inside, carrying the distant scent of rain and exhaust. For a split second, Chuck considered standing and stepping off. The thought passed almost as quickly as it came. Leaving would not end this. It would only move it elsewhere, perhaps to a place with fewer witnesses and less light. The doors closed again. The bus pulled away. That was when he felt it shift. The men moved closer together, subtly at first, then with increasing certainty. The aisle narrowed, not physically but socially, claimed inch by bodies that leaned just a little too far, feet that planted themselves just a little too wide. One of them took the seat directly across from Chuck, sitting sideways so his knees pointed into the aisle, his presence invasive even without contact. Chuck met his eyes then, briefly. The look he gave was not hostile. It was calm, assessing, stripped of bravado. It said nothing and promised nothing. The man's smile faltered for just an instant before he masked it, but Chuck had already seen enough. He leaned back slightly as if settling in, though every muscle in his body remained ready. His hands rested loosely on his thighs, open and unthreatening. He was aware of the driver up front, the camera mounted near the ceiling, the way sound carried in the enclosed space. He factored it all in, not as obstacles, but as boundaries. The bus continued on its last route of the night, cutting through the city like a narrow channel through dark water. Inside, tension coiled tighter with each passing second, unseen but undeniable. Chuck understood now that the night had funneled him here deliberately, stripping away distance and chance until only choice remained. He did not know exactly how the confrontation would begin, only that it would. The men around him believed they had regained control of the situation by numbers and confinement. They believed the space belonged to them now. Chuck knew better. He remained seated, calm and composed, as the bus carried them deeper into the night, toward a moment that could no longer be delayed. The bus continued forward, its motion steady, almost indifferent, as if unaware of the quiet storm forming within its walls. Chuck felt the pressure building not as fear, but as inevitability. The men had closed ranks subtly, claiming territory without touching it, reshaping the interior of the bus into something smaller and more hostile. What had once been a neutral passage now felt like a corridor narrowing with every stop. He remained seated, his posture unchanged, but his awareness expanded outward, taking in every detail. The reflection in the dark window beside him showed more than the direct line of sight ever could. He saw one man lean back against a pole, his forearm resting casually, muscles tight beneath skin marked with faded ink. Another shifted his weight from heel to toe, impatience barely disguised as boredom. Their movements were not random. They were positioning themselves, rehearsing without words. The recognition had already happened. Chuck could feel it. The moment one of them had boarded and locked eyes with him, the night had turned. There was no longer any doubt that he had been identified, remembered, marked. The memory of the street confrontation lingered between them like unfinished business, unresolved and festering. At the next stop, the bus slowed again. Its brakes sighed, doors opening to a near-empty sidewalk washed in pale light. No one exited, no one entered. The doors closed, sealing the space once more. With that sound, something shifted among the men. A decision, unspoken but collective, settled into place. One of them moved closer, deliberately slow, using the sway of the bus as an excuse to step into Chuck's immediate vicinity. He stopped just short of contact, close enough that Chuck could feel the warmth of his body, the faint scent of sweat and cheap cologne. Another man stood behind him now, blocking the aisle in the opposite direction. The configuration was simple and effective. Chuck was no longer just seated, he was contained. The other passengers sensed it too, even if they could not name it. The woman with the bag pressed herself farther into her seat, her gaze fixed rigidly ahead. The teenagers fell silent completely, their earlier energy replaced by a stillness that bordered on panic. The man near the front shifted, glancing briefly toward the driver, then back again, as if weighing whether intervention would help or make things worse. Chuck did not move. He did not speak. His stillness was not submission. It was control. He measured the distance between his knees and the seat in front of him, the angle of the pole to his right, the width of the aisle behind the men who thought they were closing him in. He noted the camera mounted near the ceiling, its red light blinking steadily. He noted the driver's posture, rigid and forward-facing, either unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what was happening behind him. All of it mattered. The man closest to him leaned in slightly, testing the space. His expression twisted into something resembling amusement. There was no laughter now, no mocking tone. This was colder, more deliberate. The kind of moment that existed not for spectacle, but for assertion. Chuck met his gaze again, holding it just long enough to remove any doubt. There was no fear there, no hesitation, only recognition. The man straightened abruptly, as if stung by something he could not name. He took a half step back, then recovered, masking the reaction with a sneer. Chuck saw the flicker of uncertainty ripple outward, felt it pass through the group like a brief disturbance in still water. It did not stop them, but it changed the texture of their confidence. Another stop, another opening and closing of doors. The bus moved on, deeper into neighborhoods where the streets grew darker and quieter, where the lights outside thinned until only occasional pools of yellow broke the black. Inside, the brightness remained relentless, exposing every face, every twitch of muscle, every calculated glance. The men spread slightly now, no longer content to hover at a distance. One took the seat directly behind Chuck, close enough that his knee brushed the back of Chuck's seat when the bus swayed. Another stood to the side, blocking the narrow gap that might have allowed Chuck to stand and move forward. They were constructing a cage out of bodies and proximity. Chuck felt the moment narrowing. He knew how these situations escalated. He had seen it too many times to mistake the signs. They wanted him off balance, wanted him to react first, to give them justification. They wanted control of the narrative as much as the space. He refused to give it to them. Instead, he shifted his feet slightly, planting them more firmly on the floor. It was a small adjustment, barely noticeable, but it anchored him. His breathing remained slow and measured. His hands stayed visible, relaxed, resting lightly on his thighs. Anyone watching closely might have mistaken him for calm to the point of indifference. That was when one of the men spoke, his voice low enough not to carry forward, but loud enough to be heard by those closest. Chuck did not focus on the words themselves. He focused on the intent behind them. The sound was not a question, it was a provocation, an attempt to drag him into engagement on their terms. Chuck did not answer. The silence stretched, heavy and uncomfortable. The man repeated himself, this time with more edge, frustration creeping into his tone. Chuck remained still, his gaze forward, his jaw relaxed. He was not ignoring them. He was denying them the reaction they sought. That denial changed everything. The man's patience snapped. His hand came forward, not in a full strike, but in a shove meant to assert dominance, to force a response. It was the opening Chuck had been waiting for. He moved instantly, not explosively, but with decisive efficiency. His body unfolded from the seat in one fluid motion, redirecting the shove before it could land. He rose just enough to change the angle, using the confined space to his advantage. The man found his balance compromised, his arm twisted and pinned against the pole with controlled force. The movement was precise, economical, designed to stop rather than punish. The sudden shift broke the illusion of control the group had built. The bus seemed to hold its breath. A gasp rippled through the passengers. The teenagers recoiled. The woman covered her mouth with one hand, eyes wide. The other men reacted instinctively, surging forward to reclaim dominance. That was their second mistake. Chuck used the narrow aisle against them, forcing them to collide with one another, turning their numbers into an obstacle rather than an advantage. He stepped, pivoted, redirected. A shoulder slammed into a seat back. A knee buckled under unexpected pressure. The sounds were sharp but contained, thuds and grunts swallowed by the bus's interior. He was careful, always careful. He kept the conflict tight, controlled, moving it away from the other passengers. He positioned himself between the aggressors and the vulnerable, absorbing momentum, redirecting force. Each movement was deliberate, informed by years of experience that had taught him restraint mattered as much as strength. One man stumbled backward, crashing into the seat behind him, wind knocked from his lungs. Another reached instinctively toward his pocket, panic flaring in his eyes. Chuck saw it immediately. He closed the distance in a heartbeat, his forearm locking the man's wrist before anything could be drawn, twisting just enough to send a clear message. The man cried out, dropping to his knees as pain and shock overwhelmed his intent. The leader, the one who had smirked earlier, froze. The grin was gone now, replaced by disbelief. He had expected chaos, fear, submission. Instead, he was watching his group unravel in seconds, their numbers rendered meaningless by the very space they had chosen to trap their target in. Chuck held the wrist of the kneeling man for a moment longer than necessary, ensuring compliance, then released him carefully, letting him collapse against the seat. He scanned the remaining threats quickly, his mind calculating outcomes even as his body remained poised. No one else moved. The bus rolled on, its motion uninterrupted, as if nothing extraordinary were happening within. The driver still did not turn around. Whether by ignorance or design, he kept his eyes on the road. Silence settled heavily over the interior. The men who had come seeking retribution now avoided Chuck's gaze, their earlier confidence shattered. They nursed bruises, steadied themselves against poles and seats, unwilling to test him again. Chuck stood for a moment, ensuring the threat had passed, then slowly lowered himself back into his seat. He did not look at them as he sat. He did not need to. The message had been delivered more clearly than words ever could. Around him, the passengers remained frozen, unsure how to react. Fear lingered in the air, but beneath it ran something else: relief. The bus continued along its last route of the night, carrying them all forward, away from the moment that had defined it. Chuck rested his hands on his thighs again, his breathing steady, his expression unchanged. The emptiness he had felt earlier was gone now, replaced by a quiet certainty. This confrontation, unlike the one on the street, had no easy ending. It would leave marks, memories, consequences. But it had also drawn a line that could not be crossed again tonight. As the city slid past outside, dark and indifferent, Chuck remained seated in the bright interior, fully aware that the night was nearing its conclusion, and that whatever came next would be quieter, heavier, and final. The bus did not stop immediately after the confrontation. It continued forward as if nothing had happened, as if the narrow aisle had not just been transformed into a battleground and then restored to uneasy calm. The engine maintained its steady rhythm, tires whispering against asphalt, the interior lights humming softly overhead. That normalcy, artificial and fragile, pressed down on everyone inside far more heavily than chaos would have. Chuck remained seated for a few seconds longer than necessary, allowing the situation to settle completely before he shifted. His body was still alert, every sense open, but the immediate danger had passed. He felt it in the air, in the way the men avoided eye contact now, in the way their shoulders slumped and their movements grew cautious and restrained. They no longer occupied space with entitlement. They clung to it defensively, as if hoping the bus itself might shield them from further humiliation. He rose slowly, not in challenge, but in confirmation. The movement drew attention instantly. Several passengers flinched, unsure whether another surge of violence was coming. Chuck stood in the aisle, steadying himself with one hand on a pole, his presence firm but controlled. He did not advance on anyone. He simply existed in the space he had reclaimed, and that was enough. One of the men tried to laugh it off, a thin, brittle sound that died almost immediately. Another muttered something under his breath, more wounded pride than threat. Chuck did not respond. He did not need to. The structure of power had already collapsed, and anything said now would only echo emptily. The kneeling man struggled to his feet, favoring his wrist, eyes downcast. The others shifted away from Chuck instinctively, creating a pocket of space around him without being aware they were doing it. The aisle, once blocked and narrowed by intention, opened again. The bus felt larger, as if it had inhaled. Chuck took a step back toward his seat and sat down once more. The act was deliberate, a signal that the conflict was finished on his terms. He rested his hands on his thighs, palms down, grounding himself in the physical present. His breathing remained slow, measured. He felt the faint echo of exertion in his muscles, not fatigue, but awareness, a reminder of what had just occurred and what it had cost. Around him, the passengers began to move again, cautiously at first. The woman near the window adjusted her grip on her bag, exhaling shakily. The teenagers whispered urgently to each other, their words indistinct but charged. The man at the front shifted in his seat, glancing toward the mirror above the driver's head, then away again. No one spoke openly. No one intervened. Everyone waited. The bus finally slowed, approaching the next stop. The familiar hiss of the brakes sounded almost surreal in the aftermath, too mundane for the gravity of what had just transpired. The doors opened, letting in a rush of cold night air. Streetlights spilled across the floor in a pale rectangle. For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the men stood, hesitating, as if unsure whether leaving now would be allowed. Chuck did not look at him. He did not block the aisle or shift his posture. The man took that as permission. He shuffled toward the door, followed by another, then another. They did not speak to each other as they exited. Their earlier unity had dissolved, replaced by a shared desire to be anywhere else. The last of them lingered for half a second longer than the others, casting a glance back toward Chuck that held no defiance now, only something like disbelief. Then he stepped off the bus, and the doors closed behind him. The bus pulled away from the stop, carrying fewer passengers than before. The air felt lighter, though tension still clung to it like static. Chuck remained seated, his gaze forward, his expression unchanged. He felt no triumph, no satisfaction. What he felt instead was the quiet certainty that the moment had been handled as it needed to be, nothing more and nothing less. The driver glanced briefly into the mirror, eyes flicking toward the middle of the bus, then returned his attention to the road. Whether he had seen everything or only sensed enough to know not to interfere, Chuck could not say. It did not matter. The machine moved on, indifferent and reliable. The bus traveled through another stretch of darkened streets, the city thinning as it approached the end of the route. Buildings grew shorter, more spaced out. The glow of storefronts vanished, replaced by the occasional porch light or illuminated window. This was the part of town where nights were quiet and long, where people slept deeply or not at all. Chuck felt the residual tension slowly drain from his body. The tight focus he had maintained began to loosen, replaced by a heaviness that settled into his limbs. The adrenaline faded, leaving behind a familiar fatigue, deeper now but cleaner than before. It was the kind of tiredness that came after effort had been expended for a clear purpose. He leaned back slightly, resting his head against the seat, though his eyes remained open. The events of the night replayed themselves briefly in his mind, not as regrets or questions, but as confirmations. He had not escalated unnecessarily. He had protected others without turning the bus into a spectacle. He had drawn a line and held it. The bus slowed again. This time, a few remaining passengers gathered their things and moved toward the door. Chuck watched them go, noting the way some glanced at him with open curiosity, others with gratitude, others with unease. He accepted all of it without reaction. People carried their own interpretations of events. He had no need to influence them. As the doors closed once more, Chuck realized he was nearing his stop. The awareness came with a subtle shift in his posture, a readiness to transition from the contained world of the bus back into the open night. He felt the familiar sense of crossing a threshold, not just physically but internally. The bus turned onto a quieter street, its speed decreasing. The lights outside were fewer here, the darkness deeper. When it stopped, the doors opened smoothly and Chuck rose. He stepped into the aisle, his movements unhurried. There was no one blocking his path now. The space parted easily, as it should have all along. He walked toward the door, the bright interior light framing him briefly before he stepped down onto the pavement. The doors closed behind him, sealing the bus and its remaining passengers inside. The vehicle pulled away, its lights receding into the distance until it became just another moving point in the dark. Chuck stood for a moment on the sidewalk, breathing in the cool night air. The street was empty, silent except for the distant hum of traffic far away. He felt the weight of the day and night settle fully now, but it was different than before. The emptiness he had carried earlier was gone, replaced by a grounded stillness. He turned and began walking the rest of the way home. Each step felt deliberate, anchored. He was alone again, but the solitude no longer pressed on him. The city around him seemed calmer, less intrusive. The night had taken what it needed from him and given something back in return, though it was not something that could be easily named. As he moved deeper into the quiet neighborhood, Chuck understood that this chapter of the night was finished. The bus, the confrontation, The enclosed space where everything had narrowed and sharpened, all of it receded behind him. What remained was the simple act of moving forward, carrying the knowledge of where his boundaries lay and the resolve to uphold them when it mattered. The street ahead stretched out in pale light, in shadow, familiar and unremarkable. Chuck walked on, steady and unhurried, toward the final distance between himself and home. The bus disappeared down the street, its taillights shrinking until they dissolved into the darkness, leaving Chuck alone beneath a street lamp that hummed faintly overhead. The sudden quiet felt heavier than the noise had been. It pressed against his ears, against his thoughts, filling the space the confrontation had occupied moments earlier. He stood still for a few seconds, not out of uncertainty, but to let his body catch up with the night's conclusion. The pavement beneath his boots was cool and uneven, familiar in a way that required no thought. This part of the city slept differently than the center. There were no flashing signs here, no late-night storefronts fighting to stay awake. Houses sat back from the road, their windows dark or dimly lit, each one holding its own version of silence. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once, then fell quiet again. Chuck adjusted his jacket and started walking. His muscles carried the dull echo of exertion, a reminder of movement and resistance. But there was no pain worth noting. What lingered more strongly was the mental residue of the bus, the enclosed space where choices had narrowed until action became unavoidable. Now that space was gone, replaced by open air and distance, yet the weight of what had happened remained, settling slowly rather than dropping away all at once. He replayed the final moments inside the bus without urgency, the way the men had backed off, their confidence draining as quickly as it had formed, the way the other passengers had reacted, fear mingled with relief, gratitude tangled with discomfort. He understood their responses. Violence, even controlled, left an impression that could not be easily sorted into neat categories. He did not fault them for their silence or their distance. What mattered was that no one else had been hurt. That realization brought with it a subtle release, a loosening he had not felt earlier in the night. The confrontation had not ended with applause or acknowledgement. It had ended with doors closing and a vehicle moving on, carrying the consequences away from him. That felt right. Some things were not meant to linger or be celebrated. They were meant to be done and left behind. As he walked, the events of the day came back into focus, now reframed by the night's outcome. The case he had left earlier, the one that had hollowed him out with its quiet inadequacy, no longer felt as dominant. It had not been resolved, not truly, but it no longer defined the entire span of his thoughts. The night had offered a different kind of resolution, smaller in scale but clearer in purpose. He passed a row of parked cars, their surfaces dull under the streetlights. His reflection moved across their windows as he went, fragmented and fleeting. He caught a glimpse of his own face in one of them and paused for half a heartbeat, surprised by what he saw. He did not look triumphant or hardened. He looked tired, yes, but steady, grounded. That steadiness mattered more to him than anything else. He turned onto a narrower street, one that led more directly toward home. The houses here were closer together, their fences low, their yards modest. A porch light flicked on somewhere, responding to movement or habit, then remained lit. Chuck walked past without looking up. He felt no need to rush. The night no longer chased him. With each step, the earlier emptiness receded further. It did not vanish completely. He doubted it ever would. But it no longer felt like a void. It felt more like space, something that could hold reflection rather than swallow it. The difference was subtle but profound. He thought again of the young couple on the street, of the brief moment when fear had given way to possibility. He wondered whether they would remember his face or if the memory would blur into a general sense that someone had stepped in when it mattered. Either outcome was acceptable. He had not acted for recognition. He had acted because the alternative had been unacceptable to him. That understanding settled something deep inside him. The city around him seemed to acknowledge the shift, not through any grand gesture, but through its ordinariness. A breeze moved through the trees, stirring leaves against the pavement. A distant train horn sounded, low and drawn out, marking time rather than urgency. The world continued, indifferent yet intact. As he approached his block, the familiarity of the surroundings brought a quiet sense of closure. This was where the night would finally end, not with confrontation or decision, but with rest. He slowed slightly, allowing himself to feel the accumulated fatigue now that there was no reason to resist it. His shoulders dropped, his breathing deepened. He reached the front of his building and stopped, looking up at the darkened windows. Home waited behind the door, unchanged by what had happened miles and minutes away. Inside, there would be silence, the kind that no longer felt oppressive. He welcomed it. Before going in, he stood for a moment longer, letting the night settle fully around him. He felt no urge to dissect his actions or search for alternate outcomes. He knew where his boundary lay, and he had honored it. That knowledge carried a quiet satisfaction, free of pride or regret. When he finally opened the door and stepped inside, the world outside closed gently behind him. The night released its hold, leaving him with the simple certainty that some lines were worth holding, even when they demanded effort, even when they offered no reward beyond the knowledge of having stood firm. Chuck turned the lock, leaned briefly against the door, and allowed himself a slow, steady breath. The day was over. The night was finished, and for the first time since morning, he felt whole enough to rest. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, watch our next videos, and check out other stories on the channel. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and let us know in the comments where you're watching from.